Good morning. I'm happy to welcome today Dr. James Carafano from the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. He is Vice President Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy and the E.W. Richardson Fellow. Most of all, he's a leading expert in national security and foreign policy challenges. Dr. Carafano, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So I'd like to start with COVID-19 has acted a bit of a catalyst on major issues and major challenges that we're facing in the world. Mainly, we would say the great competition between great powers, whether it's the US and China or the US and Russia. So I have a direct question for you. Can the US today oppose simultaneously and respond simultaneously to the challenges of Russia and China?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think that's the foundation of the national security strategy, which, in the United States, every presidential administration kind of lays out a national security strategy that says, the public document that says, this is how we're going to approach the world. Now, quite honestly, many of those things are really just public relations documents. They either describe what the administration is already doing or they're aspirational. The differences here is we had a president came in who had no real track record on foreign policy. It was very unclear exactly what direction he would take American foreign policy. So this to me is a really important document. And in many ways, it's a blueprint that the administration has actually followed. I think what's important to understand is that it's not just about this administration. There really is kind of a bipartisan focus in the United States on looking at the world in this way. So, for example, if you look at our past three presidents, Bush, Obama, and now President Trump, they've all had the same list of concerns: Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. Now, of course, they've had other things on their list as well. President Bush obsessed about Saddam Hussein. President Obama talked a lot about climate change. President Trump puts a lot of emphasis on securing the borders. But they all had the same list. They didn't all address these countries in the same manner, but they all had the same concerns. Well, I think what's important about that from a U.S. perspective is that's a consistency of concern that we haven't had really since the end of the Cold War. Since the end of the Cold War, we've never had, from one president to the next, kind of a common approach to the world. I think that's deeply significant. I think it shows that there is a broad bipartisan consensus on what the great concerns are to U.S. foreign policy. And I must say, I think many of our friends and allies around the world have adopted that same framework. And I think that's the framework that our competitors, if you look at how China and Russia and Iran and North Korea view the world, I think that's the way they view the world. So I think this framing of a great power competition, which maybe isn't perfect because not all those countries are really great powers, but I really do think that that is kind of the defining prism through which American foreign policy gets made, through which many of our allies are thinking about foreign policy, and through which many of our competitors are thinking about foreign policy as well.
In the Middle East, you mentioned President Obama and now President Trump. Since President Obama, we've started feeling that the Middle East had less of an importance when it comes to the U.S. foreign policy, and that the U.S. was retreating a little bit from the Middle East by becoming even more independent on the energy side. And so today we're seeing China being more assertive, they've just signed an agreement or concluded an agreement with Iran, and even with all the allies, the U.S. traditional allies, Israel included, we're seeing a bit of a balancing act, trying to please the Americans, but in the same time not frustrate the Chinese. Do you see a point in time where a choice will have to be made and there'll be either us or them?
Well, I think if you look at U.S. policy towards the Middle East, it is in a bit of a transformative state. I actually think that's relatively positive. First of all, I have to say from a U.S. perspective, if you say what are the most important parts of the world to the United States? Well, the United States is a global power with global responsibilities and global interests. So we either have to be in many places around the world, or we have to have the capacity to get there to protect our interests. And if you look at the three parts of the world that really link the United States to the rest of the world, they really are Europe, the greater Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific. So from a US perspective, what we want is kind of general peace and stability and prosperity in each of these parts of the world, because that just makes our job easier, connects us to the world, it reduces the things that we have to concern about. So a stable Middle East is a vital component of American foreign policy. Doesn't matter if we're energy independent or not. First of all, the rest of the world's going to use the Middle East energy. Oil is a global commodity. A significant shift in the oil market affects us all, regardless of how much oil we have. So energy doesn't really change that picture. And there are so many other ways in which the Middle East is in the middle of everything. Air transport, sea lanes, finance, population movements. So the United States can never afford to not be concerned about peace and stability in this region. I think what we have in this administration is an attempt to find a middle ground between the Bush administration and the Obama administration. Where I think the Bush administration, in retrospect, you would argue that the approach was overly muscular, that the attempts to just go in there, fix Iraq, fix everything, that created as many problems as it solved. I think that people look at the Obama administration as the opposite way, the effort to kind of just disengage from all the troubles. That just created more problems, whether it was the metastasizing of ISIS, the continued destabilization of Libya. And I think what this administration has tried to do is to find a middle footprint between the overmuscular policies of the Bush administration and the really kind of systematic disengagement of Obama. I think that's a transformation. If we're going to match all our global responsibilities, we have to get the footprint in the Middle East right. And I think this administration recognizes that we don't want as heavy a military footprint as we've had for a long, long time, that we really had to fight 2 Iraq wars, because military conflict isn't really the solution to many of the problems. What we really want is kind of an arc of stability of friends and allies in the region, many of whom are self-sufficient in their own defense, where the U.S. can assist and train, where we provide some level of conventional deterrence, and where we're really working on the political and economic and other issues. And I think that's what you see is not the U.S. under this administration disengaging from the Middle East. What this administration, I think, is trying to do is to create a sustainable footprint in the Middle East that kind of solves the long-standing U.S. problem between kind of jumping in with both feet and trying to fix everything and running away. And we've seen this really since the 1970s, this kind of waxing and waning. What we really need is kind of a sustained footprint. And I think that's going to be really what the region is looking for, is a predictable, sustainable U.S. presence. Now, what does that mean for China in the region? Look, the U.S. has never asked countries to not do business with China. I mean, we do business with China. What we ask for countries is to look after their own self-interest and do a level of engagement in business with China that doesn't compromise their own sovereignty and independence, because that, again, when outside forces come into the Middle East, that's what creates problems. So, I think we need to be clear-eyed about the relationship. We all need to be clear-eyed about our relationships with China. The reality is China is their foreign policy is one of the great destabilizing forces in the world today. Every place they've gone in and touched, they have brought corruption. They have interfered in local governments. They have done what's best for China and nobody else. That's just the reality of it. Doesn't mean you can't do business with China. Doesn't mean you can't have relationships with China. Doesn't mean you can't work with China on some things. but I just think there's a degree of skepticism there. And I think if countries were facing China alone, they might not have a lot of choices. But I think if the U.S. is present, engaged in the region, if others are present, engaged in the region, if there are alternatives at the economic, political, diplomatic level, then having a constructive relationship with China that doesn't compromise a country's sovereignty and integrity, I think that's possible. But I do think the answer is you have to be cautious as you develop relations with China.
I mean, if we come to the stability point in the Middle East and having, let's say, middle powers of the
Right.
region take a more important and more assertive role, and we've witnessed it in the past few years. What we face basically in the Middle East is a constant interference, let's say, from countries like Iran. Today, we see also Turkey playing a more direct role, and it's not a question of their self security or their own. It's exporting their ideology, exporting their problems, whether it's in Lebanon with Hezbollah or whether it's Yemen and other countries. And so, how do we balance this in the Middle East where we have these conflicts? So, to start with Iran, what would be a positive outcome with Iran not going through a regime change, but bringing them closer to the region? How would this materialize?
Yeah, well, first I say I don't put much stock in the Iran-Chinese agreement. The reality is other than oil, those countries have very little to offer each other. China actually has stockpiled a great amount of oil anyway. In the short term, it's kind of meaningless. But the Chinese are not going to go out on the limb for the Iranians. They'll veto something in the UN Security Council, but they're never going to go to the mat for the Iranians. The Iranians really can do nothing for China. I think they see it as kind of a propaganda. We're working together to push back on the United States. I don't think we see that as a very significant. There's a natural alignment between Iran, China, and Russia. They're all authoritarian. They all don't like the United States. They all have significant regional designs that the U.S. gets in the way of. But other than that, they really don't have that much to offer that other. And there's no sign that they have any willingness to really, in a sense, go to the mat for each other. I think the reality is the Iranian regime is the business of the Iranian people. Our mission really is to minimize Iran's destabilizing influence in the region. I think the U.S. has done that by directly trying to limit the capacity of Iran to export evil. Drawing up the money supply really limits their ability to support the surrogates. We've significantly supported countries that are pushing back at Iran. We've tried to help them build up their military capabilities. I personally believe that the real way forward here is we do need something. I mean, I think the U.S. current proposal is called a Middle East Security Architecture. We do need some kind of political, military, economic architecture that includes the nations of the region and brings in the United States as a stabilizing force that creates a sustainable, dependable deterrent over time. Now, this isn't NATO. The Middle East is not Europe. Nobody's looking for an alliance that looks like NATO, but we do need something that is stronger than just the bilateral alliances that we have, that creates some level of trust and confidence in the community. And we all know that's very, very difficult. When we look at relations today, for example, between Qatar, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, when we look at Turkish relations with many of the Arab countries, we look at the kind of disruptive state that Iraq is in today. Of course, the enormous pressures on Jordan hosting massive refugee population, small country. Egypt's, it has its own set of issues, and of course, Egypt's, deeply concerned about what's going on in Libya, and Libya, Tunisia, Morocco really are a base on which the Middle East sits. So there's a whole host of reasons to say, well, there's problems, we can't do this, but there's a real argument for getting to this kind of architecture would help address those problems, and it would definitely create a sustainable front against Iran. And I think that would send the right message to the Iranian people that nobody in the region accepts the designs of this regime. The Iranian people aren't even happy with it. They don't like the fact that all their money and resources are poured into an external agenda which does nothing for the Iranian people. So I think that's the right long-term answer. And I really would hope that this, and I know this administration hasn't forgotten the idea of a Middle East security architecture. It's still on the table. I hope, particularly if the president gets reelected in November, that this is something they come back to, and something that allies in the region take seriously.
You mentioned NATO and Libya, and we saw, for example, France pulling out of a naval mission in the Mediterranean, complaining about Turkey's role in Libya. We've noticed a certain retreat of the US when it comes to the Libyan file, and some were even surprised to see sort of support to Turkey and the GNA in the region. How do you see in the coming period the Libyan file playing out?
Yeah, look, this is one where I really think there's an important role for the United States, not in terms of boots on the ground, but really in terms of a diplomatic role. The United States, we are truly a neutral partner here. Our only interest is really a stable Libya. Even the Obama administration, I think they did. I think their policy was just disastrous, but their motives were right. The United States doesn't have a strategic interest in Libya, but we do have an interest in a stable Libya because it's part of that chain. You have Morocco, Tunisia, Libya. You want that area to be stable because that's the foundation in which the Middle East sets on. That's the linkage between the Middle East and Africa, and the linkage between Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. So, in my mind, nothing is more admirable than a Morocco, a Libya, and Tunisia that are an area of growth, peace, and stability. And of course, Libya is the great weak link there. The challenge we have is, again, it does seem like that the greatest harm in the Middle East comes not from internal to the region, but from external forces kind of imposing their will on the region. You have, the list is long, right? France, Italy, Turkey, Egypt, UAE, Russia, everybody with kind of their own agenda. And the reality is none of them have the capacity or capability to really impose something on Libya, and none of them themselves are a solution. So I think the U.S. has to come to the table as to help find a constructive solution forward. You mentioned Turkey a couple of times. Obviously, Turkey remains a member of NATO. I don't think that's going to change. Turkey itself has issues with Russia and Iran. I don't think that's going to change. I think a lot of us debate some of the wisdom of Turkey's foreign policies, but the reality is Turkey is a country, and the United States is going to have to work with. And I do think at the end of the day, Turkey and the United States can find ways to work together, but I don't think that happens unless the U.S. plays a more assertive role. And I think it has to play a more assertive role in Libya. This administration has been reluctant to do that because they've looked at the mess the last administration left them, and they're like, we don't want to get involved. But I think just geopolitically, the United States has to play a leadership role, and I'm always hopeful, and I continue to be hopeful that the United States will step up, because I don't see a good end here without some kind of somebody coming to the table and saying, look, we've got to come up with an equitable solution. The Russians aren't going to do that. Nobody's going to win this thing at the end of the day, and it could get a lot worse.
But just a small follow-up, we see that Turkey is mentioning the establishment of military base now in Libya, something that Egypt opposes vehemently.
Right.
What would be, in your view, the US position if Turkey really establishes long-term military bases in Libya?
Well, I think none of these things are problem solvers, right? A Turkish base in Libya is not going to end the conflict in Libya. I mean, I think what's lacking is an overarching approach that all parties can live with. And I think unless somebody comes to the table as the guarantor of that approach, I just don't think it's going to happen. I think it's got to be the United States.
Do you think that the US, when it comes to the Middle East, should be more worried about the Russian role or the China? Who's the biggest competitor in the Middle East today?
Well, I think, today, to me, neither of those are really at the top of the list. I think the Russians have very limited capacity to expand their interest and influence in the region. They just don't have the muscle to do that. Russia only flows to places of weakness. Even if you look in Syria, I mean, they've maintained their position in Syria, but at what cost? I mean, they've put tons of resources into the country. The country's been virtually destroyed. They've held on to Damascus in their military base. Doesn't really take them anywhere else. It's a dead end for them. If they could have had a decisive role in Libya, they would have done that a long time ago. I don't think the Russians can go anywhere. I think right now the Chinese, have been challenged globally. I mean, look at the pushback. The United Kingdom kicked them out. Australia, which used to be very subservient to China, has completely flipped on that. So China's got all kinds of problems, and I think, and unlike many parts of the world, the Chinese can't walk in with UAE and Qatar and Saudi Arabia with a checkbook and say, and just buy them up. So, I don't think Russia and China are the places that you start. I think right now the chief source of destabilizing influence in the region is Iran. I think you have to deal with the problem of Iran and the surrogates, and then everything else is kind of subservient to that.
So going to Iran, if we look at Lebanon, Lebanon that is in complete, falling into complete chaos, and with what we have today, which is a Hezbollah government, we seem to see that the US is a bit lost in what to do. Should they support the army? Shouldn't they? There's a lot of different opinions. In your view, what can be a positive outcome, knowing that really Hezbollah is entrenched within the country, armed, whereas the others are not? And as we see the protests, what scenarios do you expect for Lebanon?
Well, again, I think my approach has always been, and my argument is focus on the taproot of the problem, the heart of the problem, not the periphery. So look, Hezbollah would never be in the dominant position it is in today without Iranian support. But Assad might not even be in power without Iranian support. The militias in Iraq would be destabilizing Iraq without Iran. There wouldn't be a protracted civil war in Yemen without Iranian support. So I think the most effective thing the U.S. can do right now is the more we can limit the capacity of Iran to export support to these countries, the more we dry up that, the more stressed Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthi rebels, the Iraqi militias will become. So the focus of U.S. strategy right now is on really kind of putting the pressure on the Iranian regime. I think that, I think practically that is where the U.S. is going to remain. If you start to get into when you start to get into the eaches of these situations, they're very complicated, they're very muddled, and we're not going to get in a situation where the United States is going to be putting boots on the ground in Lebanon. We're going to be trying to parse out, parties in this. So of course we don't want a civil war, but I think if we deal with Iran and Iran cannot support these groups and these groups are on their own and struggling, then we can look maybe how we can participate in some regional solutions. I think this administration would love to see, particularly in this administration, when this president likes to see people who take responsibility and where the United States comes in and assists that. And so I think, again, we'd love to see regional solutions come up, and the United States is willing to backstop that rather than the United States coming and say, okay, we're going to give you the answer to Lebanon. I don't think that's going to happen from this administration.
I have two last questions. So the last one concerning Iran, would the U.S. welcome an engagement from Arab countries to negotiate directly with Iran to try and find common grounds, and so what is the end game, or this pressure has to come up with a regime change, or at least force them to come to the table and come to their senses and stop these exporting and behave like on bilateral government to government relation? What is the end game?
This administration is always in favor of negotiation. And they'd be happy for bilateral dialogues. I don't think they have a problem with that. But I mean, this president is very sequential in terms of how solutions get addressed. It's first the problems get solved, then the sanctions come off. And this administration's put a list of, I think, 10 or 11 things on the table that are concerned. It's not just the nuclear program. It's the support for the surrogates, and it's the terrorist activities. All those things, and the ballistic missile program, all those things have to be put on the table, and Iran has to, and then we can talk about sanctions relief, engagement, expansion, everything else. The U.S. has been consistent that way with North Korea, with Russia, with China, and I think that's the way forward. I think obviously from the Iranian perspective right now is they're just kind of waiting out the election. I mean, I think their hope is a new administration comes in, and the new administration fallback position is to, engage with Iran, take all this stuff off, and then, see what they can work out. This administration is not going to do that. I think the Iranians are just hoping that a different team comes in. Regardless of the results of the election in November, I think a shift in U.S. policy would be a disaster for the region. Letting Iran back in the game after having invested, we've done that before. Even the Obama administration, which never sanctioned Iran to the degree that the Trump administration did, they put Iran in a tough place. And then they turn right around and kind of let them out of let them have everything they wanted to. And look what it got us. I think, allowing Iran back into the game would be just horrific for the region.
Just the last question, which is more global and around a subject that you know very well, which is cyber warfare. So is the day of fighting soldiers soon over, and every conflict or every competition will be in the cyber and data?
No, it's exactly the opposite. Look what's going on with Iran and Israel right now. They're in cyber conflict, and if anything, that's expanded more in a kind of covert conflict and warfare. So cyber conflict's part of everything, but the notion that we're all just compete electronically and we won't, think of if the cyber is the tank, we're still going to have airplanes and soldiers and battleships. If anything, it's going to increase the propensity for conflict. That's why it's really important to be able to be resilient on the cyber front. This is why the idea of a Middle East security architecture is so important. Space, cyberspace, maritime space, airspace, missile defense. There is not in an aggressive way of being a threat to anybody, but for collective self-defense, there is so much that the region could and must do together to really bring the hope of a generation of peace to the region, an umbrella that really allows for prosperity to really blossom across the region and really kind of bring, really there are points in the history of the human race where the Middle East was the greatest font of wealth and knowledge. That wasn't just an accident. I mean, that's the natural geography of the Middle East. It's the center of the world. What's taken it from that place, and it really is the lack of the region to really be able to function as an integrated region at peace with itself. That's the place we've got to get back to.
I mean, Dr. Carafano, thank you very much for your time. I hope that we'll be able to continue this conversation another time, but it was very insightful and gave us a lot of information on where the US stands on many issues. Thank you so much.